So yes, once again, thanks for having me. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to get right into it. And once again, as Emily mentioned, if you have questions, comments, ideas, definitely post them to her and Erica. So what I'll be talking about today is based on my research, which was first sparked by a high school student named Quincy. And he, along with 19 of his peers, took part in a nonprofit school-based youth program that I started in 2000 called R.E.A.L. R.E.A.L stands for Respect, Excellence, Attitude, and Leadership. It was initially formed at a charter school on the south side of Chicago that really wanted some help in reaching their Black and Latinx males and how to get them more involved in school, develop more of an affinity for education, and to decrease their absence from schools and as well as their tardiness. And so R.E.A.L was really started off as this kind of youth mentoring piece, but really slowly evolved into not just mentoring, but also youth activism. And so while on the one hand, we're focusing on social emotional learning in Chicago public schools, we also wanted to work with young folks, particularly middle school all the way to high school, who were interested in examining community spaces and expressing their issues through various art forms, such as, the arts, social media, public awareness campaigns, petitions, or community service. And so one of the arts-based activities to filter in through these various formats was hip hop. And so this particular piece by Quincy, once again, served as what ignited my research and as well as my community activism on this topic. So Quincy writes, "The cops in my school be the ones on my block, stopped and frisked daily from my hoodie to my socks. Now I'm late for class, but they don't give a. Seeing my black ass is like seeing guns. Wow, because they're the ones packing. Hallway terminator, straight prison tracking. Waiting for your ass just to. Now you sit in the cell, you don't know what's up. With the charge they gave to you, locked out of class, plus homeroom too. How we gonna learn inside a human zoo?" And I thought, when I first read this, and once again, students only had maybe an hour to write these lyrics, their poetry, their spoken word. And the program, up until the first, 8 years running the program, or rather 18 years running the program, meeting these students, one of their issues was around schooling as a kind of caged experience. Prior to that, working with young folks, they had complaints about teachers who were biased towards them or racist towards them, school conditions with leaky roofs, bad cafeteria food, outdated curriculum, things of that nature. So this is the first time that we actually had come across young folks who were talking about schools and communities as virtual cages. And this, mind you, falls right in line with what was happening at the time, was around gentrification and the closings of schools, CPS schools in Chicago. And so there was an uptick in securitization of both schools and communities. But this idea of what that Quincy talks about with respect to human zoos really drew my attention. And so I asked the class, the students who were in the program, if there was, if they knew anything about human zoos. Even though I knew Quincy metaphorically, I wanted to know that this was an actual literal phenomenon, and they didn't. And so I used one of the classroom sessions, one of the R.E.A.L program sessions, to talk about human zoos. And so during the late 1800s, all the way up to the 20th century, colonial exhibits in the Western world showcase not only artifacts of indigenous people, but they showcased indigenous people. And this started in the era before cinema, and it stretched all the way into, if you can believe it or not, it stretched all the way from the late 1800s all the way to as late as 2005. The last known example of human zoos in 2005 is the Adelaide Zoo in Australia. So human zoos allowed Westerners to see indigenous folk who were, mind you, human trafficked from areas, continents such as Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas into these various zoos. And the idea was to give Westerners an up close and personal experience with human beings, if they, and many probably didn't see them as human beings, with cultures that they had only heard about or read about. And so these exhibits garnered huge audiences in global cities like Paris, Zurich, New York, the Bronx Zoo, for example, St. Louis. And between 1870 and 2005, approximately 1.4 billion people viewed these human zoo exhibits. You can see on the right, pull it up, a Congolese pygmy, Otabinga, was put on display at the Bronx Zoo in New York City. The display was in the primate exhibit, and Otter was often made to carry around chimpanzees and other apes. Eugenicist and zoo director William Hornaday labeled Otter the missing link. So you kind of see the attitude, the racist, white supremacist attitude around these formations, these constructions. Throughout the late 18th century and well into the 19th and 20th centuries, Africans, in some cases Native Americans, were kept in exhibits and zoos. The photograph to the left is of a girl in a Brussels, Belgium zoo in 1958. So even though human zoos have been outlawed for the most part, the language describing folks who are considered other still exists. And we know that people of color are often labeled as migrants, illegals, swarms, people from shithole countries, not my language, but those are some of the words to describe and to objectify cultural groups. And so human zoos, both literally and figuratively, essentially merge out of a racist cultural representation or misrepresentations of peoples of color. And there's a long history when it comes to racial disparities, which are perpetuated in two essential ways. One, through stereotypes and misconceptions of racial difference, and two, through biased institutional practices. And so I'm going to talk about cultural representations. So with respect to cultural representations, peoples of color, and in the context of this discussion today, specifically Black and brown males, Black and Latinx males, are often labeled in schools and in the broader society as low achieving, cognitively delayed, aggressive, loud, libidinous, or salacious, or deviant. And once again, there's a long history to that. So the piece that we're looking at here is from a book, the inner cover of a book published in 1900, written by Charles Carroll, who used biblical reference to assert the inhumanity of Blackness, right? And he wasn't the only one. There were a number of well-known authors at the time. I started watching this show called Lovecraft Country. And if anyone knows anything about H.P. Lovecraft, Lovecraft was very prolific in his writing of science fiction horror, but was also equally prolific in his attitudes and writings about Black folk and brown folk as less than human, as subhuman, women as being lesser to man, and just a whole range of misogynistic and racist attitudes, which, mind you, is still a part of the conversations that we know today, unfortunately. The second image is an item from the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, which is in Ferris State University in Michigan. And it shows a cartoonish depiction of an ill-intentioned Black character grabbing a white woman. And of course, most of us, if not all of us, know the story of Emmett Till, who in 1955 was kidnapped, beaten, shot, left in the river by at least 2 white men in Mississippi. His mother, Mamie Till Bradley, displayed Emmett's body at the funeral. So once again, that particular tragedy comes at the cost of misperceptions of individuals, of people who are of color. And it still exists, right? You know, we talk about Emmett Till. We know that the parallel to that in modern day is George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin incident, where Trayvon Martin was shot by George Zimmerman in a confrontation in 2012. LeBron James posing with Giselle on Vogue's April 2008 issue, right? And you see the parallels that have been drawn between those cultural representations and Black men in particular. And then to the left, I'm not sure how many remember the story in May 2018 where Dante Robinson and Rashawn Nelson were arrested in Philadelphia Starbucks while they were waiting for a business partner. And there was, but their arrest, right? One can easily make the argument that it was because of their skin tone. It was because of them being also male that they were treated that way. And that goes for every image that I've just shown you. So with regard to institutional practices, disproportionate sanctions, school suspensions, expulsions, driving while Black, and high arrest rates against folks of color give rise to feelings of frustration with racism. But it also reduces their affinity for education and chances at life success, pushing many young men and women of color away from their education, away from their schools, and into high-risk factors such as poverty, poor health, incarceration, and even death. And once again, there's a long history of that. We look at slavery, in the American context, 1619 to 1863, sharecropping, 1865 to 1894, which in many instances was just another form of slavery, where newly freed Black men and women were not given their 40 acres and a mule and ended up sharecropping with previous slaveholders who did not pay them, or in many instances paid them less than that might as well just have been equitable to working for free. And then, of course, you have Jim Crow from 1877 to the 1950s, separate but equal public facilities, from housing to healthcare to schools, of course, employment. And then Nixon's war on drugs, right, which later became Bush's war on drugs, and then Clinton's war on drugs, and then the other Bush's war on drugs. And so that kept that particular phenomenon leads to the prison industrial complex, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But with respect to residential segregation in Jim Crow, some of us may be familiar with redlining, right, where particular neighborhoods and communities for businesses were color-coded, right? So you had red lines, which meant that this was not the place for businesses to establish themselves and to develop because of the dominance or the predominance of Black residents and citizens in the area. You had yellow lines in certain areas where it was like, well, it's not that bad yet. There's not a lot of people of color in this area yet. So you can take your chances in moving and establishing a business there. Then, of course, you had green lining, which meant that it's all clear. Like you can set up shop in these areas without fear of racial mixing and racial customers even. And so moving forward, gentrification, and of course we know that that's happening now. Gentrification, well, we also refer to it as urban renewal, where those who are typically working class or low income are being pushed out of communities by middle class, higher income residents and business leaders who want to refashion the community into more high end. That also speaks to school closures, right? So if a community is being gentrified, often the school that was previously working class and low income, predominantly Black and Latinx, is closed, right? And gutted out, right? And those students are then pushed out of those particular schools as well as their own communities. The prison industrial complex, which in many respects has become this literal, which is a literal human zoo. Right? The mass incarceration of Black and brown folks, particularly men, as a result of Nixon's war on drugs, speaks to the rise of the prison industrial complex. And then, of course, the STPP, the school to prison pipeline. And just to say something about that, a colleague of mine out of UIC, Erica Miners, really kind of changes that concept of a pipeline and considers it more of a swamp. Right, so it's not just schools that serve as a pipeline for students from school to prison, and then in some cases ultimately death. But it's multiple social impediments, right, that lead to high risk factors in their lives, such as poverty, poor health, and incarceration, and so forth. And those multiple social impediments, right, emerge from slavery, emerge from sharecropping, the ever existent Jim Crow that folks in places like Chicago, New York, LA experience. We don't see it in this as legal in the context of, say, for example, the U.S. Constitution or even local and state laws, but there's a long history of these particular laws that existed that advocated for racial separation, that it becomes part of the mindset of individuals. And so the idea that people don't want to live next door to a white person, doesn't want to live next door to a Black person, is not just influenced by perhaps cultural cues, but also legal cues, right? Things that they grew up experiencing. So now, with respect to the prison industrial complex, human zoos, schools being a microcosm of the larger society reflect that same very figurative and literal context, right? So when we look at the racial injustice that we see outside of schools, we can still find that same phenomenon happening within, that same phenomenon of racial injustice happening within American schools, particularly urban schools that are majority Black and Latinx, 85% Black and Latinx. So within these majority minority schools, and some of them may even, all the pictures that I'm showing you, or I'm going to show you, are public schools. These are not jails or prisons. These are public schools. And within urban schools that are majority minority, Black and brown skin is forever faded as America's utmost social liability and threat, and thus dictates the most control. And so inner city schools, complete with closed circuit TVs, police patrols, isolation rooms, lockdowns, strip searches, drug sniffing dogs. They force young folks to conform to micro and macro systems of internment and isolation. Right? This is, as Quincy writes, the cops in my school be the ones on my block. right? And that encapsulates the organic relationship between schools and society. And so the same cops that are in Quincy schools, that are assigned to securitize Quincy School, are the same ones that patrol his neighborhood. And so there is, from sunup to sundown, this constant relationship with police that we don't really see in other communities. So during the real session where we're talking about human zoos and connecting it literally to other institutions, we decided to create a list. Students and I decided to create a list just to show parallels between schools and prisons. And so for these young folks that I'm working with, that are enduring cage windows and barbed wire fences, the school complex is beyond similitude to jail, right? It is jail, right? And from its culturally relevant, irrelevant curriculum and punitive methods to its decaying physical plant and overcrowded classrooms, the daily curriculum of these students that they witness is this internalization of schools as controlled spaces, right? That are about enforcement, that are about, that feel like mass incarceration. And so when we talk about prisons as holding those who are disenfranchised, they feel that schools also, even though they're great places to learn and to meet people and to develop relationships and mentors and so forth, by and large, these majority minority apartheid schools that are underfunded, they feel disenfranchised in, right? Prisons as an authoritarian structure, right? Schools as an authoritarian controlling structure. In prisons, you get searched by police. If you have something, they take it. That doesn't belong on site, they take it. The same thing happens in schools. Surveillance cameras, right? In some cases, even in bathrooms within schools, believe it or not. And had I not seen them myself, I wouldn't believe it. And which is interesting because depending on where they are, it avoids the policy that says that they can't be there. So you have them away from the actual area where young folks are using the bathroom, and it's in spaces where there's a sink and where they can first enter. Surveillance webcams on computers, no food from the outside, right? So students can't bring food from home into schools. The whole, right, in prisons. The whole also is parallel to schools in suspensions and in holding cells, isolation classrooms, and some even said special education. They thought that special education was a holding cell until they were old enough to come into contact with the criminal justice system as an adult. The use of handcuffs, students have been arrested as prisoners are arrested, or as those who break the law breakers are obviously arrested and put in handcuffs. So were students. Police dogs and armed raids happens within schools as well. Within prisons, of course, there are electromagnetic door locks as a part of security. We see the same thing happening within schools, and then privatized food providers, which also is another parallel. So just to contextualize the ideas of some of these students and their perspectives, here are a few figures that I'd like to go over. So CPS serves, as of 2019, 2020, CPS serves roughly 355,000 students, 87% Black and Latinx. And that number has dropped over the last 10 years by like 100,000 students. Currently, there are 642 schools, elementary 477, and 165 secondary schools in Chicago, in CPS. 2013, CPS used $16.1 million on the Safe Passage program. And so Safe Passage emerged out of school closings that happened in 2012, 2013, and onward. And so as students, once again, understanding schools and society is one, right? It's an organic relationship. As neighborhoods were being gentrified and going through urban renewal, folks were being pushed out of those communities, right? Low income, working class folks were being pushed out and replaced by high income, middle class residents. So in a place like Chicago, because it's incredibly segregated, the concentration of segregation is so incredibly intense in Chicago. You can be living in a low-income Black neighborhood. It's being gentrified. You're pushed out. Where do you go? Well, you go to where people look just like you in many instances, right? Share the same cultural values in some respects, and it happens to be another low-income, working-class Black community. So you're being put into that, and so that shift. Now you're in an area where there's already limited resources, and there can be friction between individuals who live there already and those who are coming into the community. There can be friction around resources, jobs, schooling, access to these resources, healthcare, you name it, employment. But there also could be cultural shifts or cultural friction with, you're part of this particular gang, I'm a part of this particular gang, and we don't get along. And so now that you've got these folks in this space, right, living on top of each other, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be murder. There's going to be death. There's going to be pain. There's going to be a lot of bloodshed in many instances. If you have folks who are vying over limited resources, they are going, in often cases, attack one another. And so as schools are shutting down, now you've got kids who are in schools and their neighborhood school shuts down. So they have to then travel 2, 3, 4, 5 miles to go to another school. And in that school, there just so happens to be students who know they're not from there. And so you're coming in, we're fighting over limited resources, we're fighting over, out-of-date books, computers, overcrowded classrooms, there's no place to sit. And so there can be a lot of beef can start, right? And so this is the problem when we talk about one, gentrification, and two, it's parallel school closures. And so then you have this program, Safe Passages, which was started by Mayor Rahm Emanuel, providing $16.1 million. And it had police officers, school resource officers, parents on corners, making sure students could get from school to home and back safely, which ultimately becomes a Band-Aid for the racist, classist experience that they're already experiencing, right? So as opposed to creating, right, generating, taking that $16.1 million and creating safe environments, expanding locations, despite the segregation that exists, then why not put that money towards that as opposed to the Band-Aid of Safe Passages? And mind you, effective in many respects, but once again, unnecessary. So April 2016, 248 police officers were assigned to 75 primary and secondary schools within CPS. Doesn't seem like a lot, but we're talking about primary and secondary schools, and the idea that we would have police officers who have no training in human development, no training in middle school psychology and philosophy, no training in adolescent development, no training in early childhood, being around young people who are often, particularly teenagers, who are often stereotyped as violent, as aggressive in any respect. And then you add skin tone to that, right? And now you could be 14, 13 years old, but because you're Black, because you may be physically developed, going through puberty, you're standing at 5'11", 6 feet, you're seen as a threat. You're not seen as a child. You're seen as a threat, as an adult threat in many instances. And so between 2012, 2016, police officers assigned to the Chicago Public Schools accumulated over $2 million in misconduct settlements for activities on and off school grounds. Once again, another Band-Aid, right? So we're going to spend $2 million for misconduct settlements that are happening between these police officers and these young folks. Currently, 5 schools, Back of the Yards College Prep, Roberto Clemente High School, Bento Juarez Community Academy, Northside College Prep, and Hancock Academy voted to remove their officers from their campuses. It's huge, right? And officers also include SROs, school resource officers. So you have CPD as well as school resource officers. And then 2019, CPS spent $33 million SROs and CPD. 2020, 2021 year will be $15 million. There'll be a $15 million reduction in that, right? So that's huge, right? Because previously CPS had been spending upwards of $54 million as early as 2012, 2013 on CPD and SROs. So now that we talk about a lot of the issues, a lot of the problems that are happening with respect to racial justice and injustice in schools and outside of schools, and once again, that organic relationship, right? Whatever's happening inside, whatever's happening in the large society is happening in schools, no doubt, right? Young people don't leave their needs, issues, and concerns at the threshold of the school. They bring them inside with them, right? And whatever's happening inside that school then finds its way out into the community as well. So what can we do inside schools? So definitely preparing teachers to be culturally sensitive and racially conscious, right? So when we look at some of the figures around educators in American schools, 85% of elementary school teachers are white middle-class females, right? That number drops to about 60% when we get to high school. Young folks, particularly in Chicago, in urban schools across the nation, make up 85+% of students, right? Now, but of that 85%, 41% are 13% are students of color, but 41% of that 13% of students are referred for special education services, who are labeled as first labeled as aggressive, right? Labeled as deviant, right? But then take on educational labels as cognitively delayed, or has an oppositional defiant disorder, or is exponentially handicapped, right? So the cultural misperceptions guide the hand of judgment. And so educators must examine their underlying beliefs and attitudes and biases. That's critical. So what are your views about this particular group? What are your views about that student in front of you who doesn't look like you, doesn't talk like you, the parents don't look like you or talk like you? How are you treating them? And the third one, assimilationist versus culturally relevant pedagogy. So we know that Donald Trump just signed Patriot Education Act, which further reinforces white education or the education of whiteness in schools across the country. Schools receiving federal dollars for the use of that kind of curriculum, which is essentially assimilationist curriculum, the kind of curriculum that tells you that Christopher Columbus discovered America, that Thomas Edison, created the light bulb, things of that nature, right? Without really digging deep into other racial groups and their contributions prior to their subjugation, right? Prior to their colonization. And so as a student who is of color, right? As a minority student, what does this curriculum have to do with my life? What is the relationship of this curriculum to my culture, right? And I would add to that, how is the curriculum also socially relevant? Does it speak to my particular age group? Does it speak to the things that I'm experiencing both in a temporal sense as well as in a social cultural sense, right? Versus assimilationist, which is essentially telling students you need to conform, right? That your history in the case of Black folks begins with subjugation, it begins with slavery, right? And your contributions were minimal, right? And we can also whitewash those contributions in order to make your assimilation fit within American society. Right? And that's part of obviously it's clearly an injustice, but that's part of how we fail to address a lot of the larger social political issues in our society by just washing over them. So motivated educators who push for superior work, right? So a lot of the young folks that I work with in the R.E.A.L program, they recognize that the expectations of their teachers aren't really that high, right? They recognize that the curriculum, many of them recognize that the curriculum is not of high quality and that energizes them, that cognitively, intellectually stimulates them, right? And so what is the result of that? Well, sometimes we see an inflation of grades, right? They didn't really earn an A, because the A at this particular school that's under-resourced and where students are being undereducated would be a D or even an F at a highly resourced, high quality, intellectually engaging school, right? And so young folks fall through the cracks. And we can see that mostly when they leave high school and they enter into college and they're not prepared because they weren't prepared in earlier years, right? So that's that push for superior work. Kill the dysfunction, right? Help students have their basic needs met within the system, right? If we are not going to deconstruct, right, rethink, rebuild the system, right, then how can we help them navigate it? And part of that comes through mentoring, right? So someone that young folks trust, right? Someone that sees young folks as fully human, as multidimensional, as more than the stereotypes and misconceptions, right, that shroud their lives. Having role models, having students exposed to role models within schools and within communities, constructive folk, support systems, right? And so we need that, right? So less cops, more counselors, right? More mental health facilities and spaces within schools. We don't need the social worker or the school psychologist who has the caseload of 50 students, and she can only really handle 20, and she's only there, or he is only there, twice a week in the school. Right? Young folks go through something every single day, right? And so they need those support systems in place. Appropriate discipline strategies versus hyper suspension and expulsion. We'll talk about that soon in the next slide. Identifying options. So what are options? What are other options other than suspension and expulsion, isolation rooms, right? And then, of course, in prison schooling. What that means is that this kind of newer idea around, which has been happening for some time around defunding police, it's really reached we hear more about it now because of the present atmosphere, but defunding police has been an initiative that's been going on for over a decade. And how do we, not necessarily in policing, although that is an option, right? But how do we take away some of the funds and put them more towards support systems that engage young folks intellectually, socially, emotionally, and physically, other than spending millions of dollars on police, spending millions of dollars on lawsuit settlements, right? Changing that dynamic, thinking outside the box, right? And so ending this idea, very, very real experience of schools as a human zoo. And then what do we do in terms of justice, liberation, and hope outside of schools? And so without a doubt, and we've been seeing a lot of this, is community organizing against economic and educational inequities. And that requires us to build together and strengthen one another, right? Even if we don't look like that person, even if we don't have the same background, whether it's social, cultural, economic, how do we build together and create not just equitable conditions, right? But conditions of justice, right? Conditions where we all have that equal chance, right? I mean, things that are laid out in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, you know, how as citizens and residents of the United States treated fairly and equitably. Youth initiatives and activism. So there are a couple examples: Good Kids, Mad City, Voices of Youth in Chicago, Education Voice, which helped in 2017, 18, helped bring about Public Law 99046. And so, so rather than suspend students or expel students, provide interventions like counseling or restorative justice programs. And it was that initiative, the Voice Initiative, which was guided by young folk, right, that led to the passage of Public Law 0456 in Illinois. The third, and then another initiative and activism, of course, is the R.E.A.L program. And R.E.A.L stands for Respect, Excellence, Attitude, and Leadership. Go to realprogram.org, look it up. But there's also Asada's Daughters and the Let Us Breathe Collective. These are young folks who are taking on initiatives and engaging in various campaigns and protests to bring justice to their communities. And that speaks to love is the root of community. So neoliberalism, which we are, you know, as an umbrella we're living under, is not benign. It values competition and redefines people as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling. And it punishes inefficiency. And so we think about that in the context of this present atmosphere, right? So yeah, I mean, the pandemic definitely shut down the world, and we know it shut down the US. And so what was the main thing that redefined America? It was consumerism, right? And that was, and anything that was not of consumerism was undemocratic. And we saw the same thing after 9/11, for those who are old enough to remember, right? Bush saying, you know, get out there and shop. Everything is fine. Just go out there and spend money, right? And we understand that is the basis of our economic system. But when it is tied with democracy, that is problematic. And with respect to inefficiency, we know that schools, through constant testing, hyper testing, and this competition for grades, they are punished when they don't meet the mark, right? These kind of almost impossible benchmarks to meet if you are particularly not receiving a high quality education. Re-educate, so shun miseducation. And that's huge because a lot of young folks realize that they're being miseducated. We live in a different age. The age in which we live in, where there's so much information, this information age, this technology age, and there's all these competing thoughts and theories, right? Whether they're real or fake. Young folks are being exposed to different ideas, and so we have to figure out how do we provide them with facts, right? With real history. And that isn't of course, isn't just students of color. That's all of our young people, right? Because I think that history will tell us in many instances that we are more connected than apart. And so we need to have that kind of curriculum that moves away from assimilationist, right? You know, the cultural mind being reprogrammed by whiteness, right? And understand that that cultural assimilation or the cultural relevant curriculum is critical, right, to building those connections in community, outside of schools and inside of schools. And then second to last, have a dialogue about racial realities. I mean, this is what's needed. Like, we're not having, and that dialogue isn't just about sitting down with your neighbors or sitting down with your school system. That dialogue is really about or a part of sitting down with your alderman, sitting down with your House of Rep, sitting down with your senator, sitting down with the president, close to the president, whoever, right, to talk about race, right, and to talk about the inequalities that exist and the injustices that exist. And as I was talking to Emily earlier, the host of our webinar here, that we need to have those conversations with leaders so that we can hold their feet to the fire, right, and create a more equitable space. Because the idea that that racism doesn't exist is another form of miseducation. And then finally, transform policies on policing and security and securitization of schools in human zoos. And so, given the spending allocations that we talked about for security spending, what else can be done, right? And what has already been done in creating more justice-oriented learning spaces in places, in school systems like CPS, like Chicago Public Schools. And we've seen these policies go into effect, right? These defunding police, defunding school resource officers in places like Minnesota, Oakland, California, Los Angeles, slow to do it, but even Denver, Colorado. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility. It's already happening. We just need to pay attention to it and figure out how do we continue to expand those measures. So thank you. I'll stop there. Great. And so if there's any questions or comments, please, we have 7 minutes left.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat and we'll start asking those. We'll be wrapping up at 1. But first, I just want to thank you, Dr. Hall, for joining us and for leading this presentation. It certainly was really impactful and an important conversation. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to send them in through the chat. We haven't gotten, so one comment that first came in, we had someone joining us this evening who serves on their local school board. So speaking to that perspective, obviously your presentation touched on a number of things from curriculum to policing, all of those things, but if you were giving suggestions to someone who serves on a local school board, what would the priorities or kind of next steps that they could be and take away?
I think that if you're on the local school board, I think one of the main priorities is to get at what are the needs, issues, and concerns of school participants, right? So that includes teachers, obviously, parents, and students, right? And so how do we understand each and every one of those needs, right? And so part of it is having conversations, separate conversations with parents, having separate conversations with teachers, having separate conversations with students, finding out what our needs and concerns are, and creating some type of I think, intervention campaign, awareness campaign, like a public awareness campaign about what the issues, needs, and concerns of that school is, right? That's the first thing. Once you have that, once you've generated that public awareness campaign at that particular school, what other schools are experiencing the same conditions and have the same or similar needs, issues, and concerns? And so now you're galvanizing, right? You're not just working in isolation, right? Which can happen, which happens all the time, right? But how do we galvanize around these issues so it doesn't seem provincial or localized?
Great. One other question was, someone mentioned that you didn't speak a lot about the role of parents in all of this. How do you think schools and parents themselves can sort of approach these issues as well?
Yeah, so that's always a very thorny issue, right? Because depending on the availability of parents, right? Whether it's work, caregiving, how parents get involved is obviously key. And we know that in communities where there's a higher socioeconomic status, right? You can have a parent at home or both parents at home who is able to readily interact with school boards, right? And so that, and we find a lot of that. Parents always involved. On the other hand, we have communities where it's difficult for parents to get involved because they're constantly inundated with other things. It doesn't mean that education is not a priority. It's just that there's other things that are happening, and so they're trying to manage it the best way they can and with time management. So the key with the parents, you have your Black helicopter moms, right? And dads, like they're always on point, like they're always there. But the parents who are absent in most cases, I find that it's really good to create community functions where parents are going to be at, right? So the school doesn't work in a vacuum from the community. The school has to work within the community and be that community school. That isn't taken for granted notion in high socioeconomic areas, right? Schools are automatically seen, like the community library is already seen as part of the community, right? The fire department, law enforcement, they're already seen as one, right? Conversely, you have those communities where those things are disparate, right? And they're isolated. So in many cases, schools have to, as an entity, engage parents who aren't readily accessible to go to schools. We know that if they're at home, we know they're there. If they're in the communities, we know they're there, right? And we can kind of garner their attention and their participation by engaging them in the spaces that they're in. Because I haven't met a lot of parents, very, 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 very little, if any, actually, who said, I don't give a damn about education. They want to be involved. And so part of it is bringing that involvement to them.
Great. Since we're running a little bit low on time here and we have a few different questions, maybe just to wrap it up, if you have any resources or suggestions for books, or if people want to continue reading and about these topics and continuing their education on their own.
So there's a really good book that's coming out next month, all right? And it's called Under Lock and Key, and it's by me. Right? And it focuses on the ways in which community schools can counter the injustices that we're finding in these kind of apartheid, human zoo learning centers, right? But there are a number of works, and I would just list off a few scholars that I think that you should look into. One, most notably, that's also doing the work is Eve Ewing. Evewing, who looks at school closures as well as has started looking into this kind of mass migration or exodus of Black folk and brown folk from the state of Illinois, as well as the city of Chicago. I would also look up David Stovall, Stovall, who's actually wrote the foreword for my next book. His work focuses on how communities can essentially galvanize and create protest spaces where their voices can be heard. And there's a whole list of others, but those are just a few to start off with.
Awesome. Great. Well, now we're at 12:59, so we will wrap it up. Thank you again to everyone who were able to join us this afternoon. We really appreciate you all dialing in or calling in from however you're calling in. And of course, Dr. Hall, thank you again so much for taking the time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to also present to our alumni this afternoon. So yeah, we will wrap it up now, but thank you all and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone.